You're listening to the Talking Air Filtration podcast, where you get to know the people that make air filtration possible and help us all breathe easier. Because clean air matters.
We'll get insights from air filtration professionals and learn how they became successful in their careers. Along the way, we will discuss best practices, guidelines, trends, and challenges in air filtration in a variety of applications. We hope HVAC, air filtration, and indoor air quality pros, including business development, engineering, building owners, and facilities management, will enjoy the insights our guests will bring to this podcast.
Jeffery Siegel is professor of civil and mineral engineering and a member of the Hub of Advancing Buildings at the University of Toronto, Bahine and Tenian Chair in Civil Engineering. He is internationally recognized for his work on indoor air quality, generally air cleaning specifically, and is a fellow of ASHRAE and a member of the Academy of Fellows of the International Society for Indoor Air and Climate, ISIAQ. His research interests include healthy and sustainable buildings, filtration and air cleaning, ventilation, and indoor air quality in residential and commercial buildings, control of indoor particulate matter, cognitive impacts of indoor air quality, and the impact of building systems on indoor microbiology and chemistry. Please welcome Jeffery Siegel. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much for inviting me here. I always like coming to NAFA. I really enjoy the talking, but I also enjoy interacting with everyone. And I think that we all know, and we have known for a long time, how do we improve indoor air quality? It starts with avoiding moisture problems, and you don't have to read it. I just put up a big wall of text from Leviticus in the Bible, and I show this for two reasons. One is because it talks about what to do if you have a moisture problem in your home. It shows that people were caring about the indoor air in buildings pretty much as long as we've had buildings. And the other reason I show this is that if you were to do a search replaced on Priest and put in mold remediator, it would be pretty current advice, surprisingly. So maybe that field hasn't advanced very much in a few thousand years. But we also know we have to deal with sources. And so this picture and the quote is from Dr. Pettenkofer, who was a German hygienist. He had a lot of early sayings about how important indoor air is, a lot of sayings like the one on the screen saying, if you've got a problem indoors, don't try and ventilate that problem, get rid of the source. Similarly, around the same time, we've known ventilation is very important. The two individuals on the screen are Catherine and Harriet Beecher Stowe. They wrote a best-selling book in the late 1860s and into the 1870s in the US about the domestic realm. It was intended for women about what to do in your home. And they have two whole chapters on indoor air quality, one on health and things you breathe indoors, and one on ventilation. And the reason I show this is because people were obviously caring about ventilation a long time ago, but this was also a best-selling book. This was in the consciousness of what people were thinking about. And they have lots of quotes. How many thousands are victims to slow suicide and murder, the chief instrument of which is want of ventilation. So we've been thinking about indoor air quality and how to improve it for a very long time. And then let's get to the subject of today, filtration. Filtration has had a much, much shorter history, especially in context of improving indoor air quality. And, I always point out, many people in this room know this, but, standard 52.2 at ASHRAE is 25 years old. It's just not that old. We're not talking hundreds of years or thousands of years. We're talking about something much more recent. Now, having said that, we know that we should all be investing in filtration. These are some data collected from different studies in office buildings and residences that show the benefit to cost ratio, how much of a return on investment you'll get if you invest in filters. And all these authors had different assumptions and different ways of calculating this, but there's a surprising consistency here. There's numbers kind of in the 10 to 100 range, meaning for every dollar you invest in filtration, you're going to get $10 to $100 in return on investment. Most of that is avoided healthcare costs. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But there's a clear rationale here to invest in filtration. It's not just particle filtration. These are some data from Josh Aldred, where he looked at this is in putting 2-inch activated carbon filters in office buildings in different cities in the US. And you can see it varies a little bit based on the city and so on. But again, the benefits are 10 times bigger than the costs. Again, most of this is healthcare costs. There are some other productivity and other benefits as well. And we care about other things too. This is from the same set of modeling, but this was looking at schools in different cities and looking at whether if we put 2-inch activated carbon filters in schools, how would that translate to fewer missed days for kids in schools. And you can see again that there is a very clear benefit. The white squares here show that we'll have many fewer missed days if we invest in indoor air quality. Not only that, we know that filtration directly impacts health. This was an effort that I was part of. It came out earlier this year at the National Academies, where we are looking at kind of the practical benefits of mitigation of fine particulate matter. And what's in the red box is one of the central findings from this effort is that there is very clear evidence that using filtration is effective for reducing PM concentrations. But there's also a lot of variation. Some studies show some health benefits, others show others. Sometimes it's inconsistent. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is trying to understand that variation a little bit. But the overall story here is filters improve health. And then, of course, you can't talk these days about filtration without talking about COVID. These are some studies that have shown filters have a benefit for COVID. The first one was a very early study. It was from fall of 2020. These are 123 elementary schools in Georgia. And the authors they just did a really simple survey. They asked administrators, did you improve ventilation, did you improve filtration, or did you improve both of them? And you can see that the rate ratio, how many cases of COVID they had, went down by numbers like went to about half or so, plus or minus, depending on what they invested in as these schools. Clear benefit. This is a paper that's not even published yet. This is what's called a preprint that I saw recently. This is 100 classrooms where they looked at the benefits. Some of those classrooms had MERV 11 filters. Some of them had MERV 13 filters. And this was a school where there was some underlying health concerns, so there was frequent qPCR testing of the students in the school. And what they found, and what's shown in this graph here, is that going from MERV 11 to MERV 13 significantly reduced the cases of COVID in the classroom. So clear benefit. And the last one I want to show is actually from me. So the blue line that's clearly much bigger than all the rest is me in 2020. I got COVID right at the end of of 2022. And we had a study going on, Zoe Hoskin, a student I supervised, where we sampled for the RNA that is associated with COVID in rooms where people were isolating with COVID, in the hallway right outside that room, and in a living room, usually on some other floor of the house. And so I was isolating in my basement. There's not really windows to speak of in the basement or exhaust fans. So I got 2 of the biggest filters I could find and ran them on full blast. And first of all, I was a super emitter of COVID. Those are the highest numbers we've seen for the RNA in any environment we've measured. But notice that hallway. There's not even a doorway. It's just a hallway off the basement. Drop the concentration of RNA by, over an order of magnitude, just with filtration. So it goes to show that, both through epidemiological data and through physical data, that filters work. So there's lots and lots of benefits of filtration. Reduced healthcare costs, reduced infectious disease, then all the benefits associated with productivity, improved cognitive function, reduced absenteeism, and then a bunch of specific health outcomes like childhood asthma. So we know that there's lots of benefits of filtration. And ASHRAE knows that there's lots of benefits of filtration. These are some quotes that the president of ASHRAE has made, and including the bottom one here: "The issue of indoor air quality is a sleeping giant whose time has come." This is Donald Blomfeld made these comments almost 40 years ago. And so even though we recognize the benefit of indoor air quality, my argument today is that we haven't seen that much action, and what can we do about that? So although I know many people in this room have moved the needle on filtration, the reality is we haven't moved it as much as we could. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. 3 are on the screen. What I want to talk about today is the one that's bolded in the middle. I think we need to do a much better job demonstrating to people who make decisions in buildings how well filtration really works. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. And I'm going to start with an example. This is some data from the University of Toronto. As a response to COVID, they upgraded ventilation and filtration in all classroom spaces at the university. And every classroom had an effective air change rate of 6 or higher, meaning that through a combination of central filtration, portable filtration, and ventilation, every classroom would. So an example is I often teach in the Wahlberg building. It was generally the classrooms there got a improvement to that 6 minimum, usually mostly through central filtration and ventilation, and a little bit through wall-mounted filters in each room. So we saw this and said, let's do some measurements. And so we measured. This was Bo and Du, a graduate student, came up with this approach that I'll actually talk about in a few minutes, but I want to show the results here. So we just deployed a low-cost monitor and then measured what the actual decay rate was. And so first look at the red. That's from carbon dioxide. The university thought we were getting a little under 2 air changes an hour in that classroom. We were seeing numbers more like 1. And the total removal, ventilation plus filtration, the university thought we were getting that 6 minimum. We're actually measuring numbers more like. So what's going on here? There's this huge performance gap. A little bit is because of the ventilation piece, but a lot of it is the filtration piece. So why aren't we getting what we think we're getting in this classroom, and it turns out many others, as I'll show you as well? Well, there's lots of issues. I'm going to talk mostly about filtration today, but let me just mention that ventilation can be an issue too. In this particular building, as in a lot of buildings, there are issues with the outdoor air damper and the controls for the damper. The airflows that were measured as part of testing and balancing weren't particularly accurate. And then this is the actual classroom where I teach indoor air quality most semesters. And you can see that the grills for the room are all on the same wall at the front of the classroom, and they're the 2 supplies on the edges and the return in the middle. So of course the air short circuits. And so you can be supplying lots of ventilation air, but it doesn't really matter unless it gets to people in the room who are breathing it.
Are your air filtration personnel NAFA certified? Ask if they belong to NAFA and have their certified air filter specialist or NAFA certified technician designations. The CAFS and NCT designations are earned after rigorous exams and demonstrate that the air filtration professional has a high degree of knowledge and professionalism. To learn more about NAFA certifications, visit nafahq.org.
But let's talk about filtration. We know that there are issues like bypass. We know there are issues of flow. We know that some filters can decline in performance depending on what they're loaded with over time. And I've showed this previously at NAFA that you can try and capture how much declines actually happen with a standardized test, something like Appendix J and 52.2, and you sometimes capture it, you sometimes don't. And so filters don't necessarily perform the way we think that they should. And we've seen this over and over again. These are some data from a study we did of 20 Toronto homes. I talked about it at NAFA in 2019. But here we had 3 different filters, a MERV 8, a MERV 11, and a MERV 14, all compared to another MERV 8 filter as a baseline. And you can see the effectiveness. This is measured over the course of 3 months, so very long-term data. most of these numbers are pretty close to zero, meaning the filters didn't really make a difference. Now, in this particular sample, that was because the fans didn't run very much. These are houses in Toronto. It was a pretty mild weather year, and so most of the year, the fans were running about 10% of the time. So of course, if you're not putting air through a filter, it can't make a difference, but you see these kind of data. And then you also see data like this. This is an article that I found very frustrating. It came out late last year, and this was done by a bunch of epidemiologists where they did a literature review to look at whether filtering and other air cleaning strategies prevented respiratory infections. And basically what they found is in the box here that they couldn't find any real benefit associated with filtration. But if you dig into the details of this article, there's a lot of very concerning things, like they assumed that any air conditioning system had filtration. And therefore, if there was a presence of an air conditioning system, they assumed that there was a filter. And so, of course, we all know what some of those filters look like in air conditioning systems. And so I'm actually writing a response to this, a letter to the editor about this paper. But there is a fair amount of skepticism in the medical community because of efforts like this. And so what that skepticism comes from is that there is a huge variation in how well a filter will perform. And that has a lot to do with things like the background ventilation. So for example, are windows open? It has a lot to do with how people are using filters. And so this is a confusing plot, but I want to use it to make one point. This is some work that Alex Mendel, a graduate student, is working on. So we found about 40 epidemiological studies in the literature that use filtration. Most of these are portable. Some of these are central systems. And he calculated what the loss rate was. The first bar in each pair is the lighter one is the loss rate without a filter, with whatever filter they used, and the darker one is the loss rate with a filter. And the blue ones aren't that different other than we feel a little bit more confident in the data just because of what the authors reported. But the point I want to make by showing you this plot is that some of these studies, like the one that's circled now, the filter makes a huge difference. There's a pretty small bar without the filter, not very much loss. You add in the filters that they used in that study, and you get a huge reduction. There are other ones, like the one that I just circled now, and you can see that there's a big background loss rate, probably open windows or something like that, and you add in a filter, and it doesn't make much difference. Maybe because of the filter choice that they used or how people use them, or often we don't know. But the important point here is that the context really matters. The very same filter is going to perform differently in different environments. And by and large, people doing these studies, which are medical or epidemiological in nature, don't characterize. So we don't know, is the filter making a difference or not making a difference, or is it some aspect of the context, or both? So we really need a way to actually assess filters and how they work. And, filters will perform differently in different buildings. They might perform differently over time. And, laboratory tests are fantastic. I'm not kind of dissing laboratory tests here, but they don't tell you anything about the context and how the person is going to use that filter in real life. So we said, can we come up with some in situ testing methodologies? And ideally, the methodology that we would like to come up with would be, fast, cheap, easy, use instruments that are not expensive, flexible to different air cleaning approaches. We'd like to be able to detect things like byproducts as well. And you'll see, I think we've made progress on some of those things. There are others that are still works in progress. So the first thing we tried is we just deployed in different environments, residential, office environments, classroom environments, a low-cost PM 2.5 monitor and a low-cost CO2 monitor. So we left them in place for, in some cases, months, in some cases, weeks. And you get this trace of data over time. This is the work of Bo and Du, a former graduate student. he used a machine learning approach and take that long time series of data and say, hey, where are all the times where it's going down and where it's going down for long enough? And from that, we can calculate what the loss rate is. And so you can look at the loss rate of carbon dioxide, and that tells you how much outdoor air is coming into the space. You can look at the loss rate of PM 2.5, and that tells you the loss rate of everything, including filters. And filters are usually much bigger than deposition. And so there's a lot of kind of math and heavy lifting behind this, but the basic process is you have this raw data, just the concentration going up and down over time. Then you use this machine learning algorithm and say, hey, let's find all the decays, all the places where the concentration is going down. And then you isolate for each of those decays and use fairly conventional approaches to say, hey, what's the actual loss rate during that time? And there's a lot of quality control and other stuff you have to do. So an example of this is an office, a graduate student office. We measured it for a few weeks. I'm showing about a week or so of data here. And you can see that, we measure on different days. We get anywhere from 2 to 10 or 15 decays that kind of meet our quality control. And we can assess what's the outdoor air loss rate by CO2 and the total loss rate. And this room didn't have any portable filters, so it was all filtration and deposition. And if you look at over time, you can see those graphs at the bottom that show there's a variation over time, which we expect. People do things like open windows, open doors, the airflow through the system changes, lots of things change, and so you get this distribution of losses. We also did this in classrooms, so this is a variant of the classroom data that I showed. This is for 9 classrooms. What you see here is the CO2 decay rates we calculated. The ones in green are from physics buildings. There was a physics professor who was monitoring CO2 and sent me months and months of data that we analyzed. And the ones in red are engineering classrooms. And you can see there's always a companion line associated, the little line beside it. That's what the university was reporting, or what they thought they were getting. And you can see they're generally pretty close in the physics building, if not better. But in the engineering buildings, for whatever reason, we tended to see worse performance than they were getting. And then we only had particle data for some of the engineering buildings, but you can again see that we're getting total loss rates by everything of particles. We tend to see numbers between, on average, with some variation, between about 1 and 2 air changes an hour, and the university thought they were getting 6, or in some cases, in one case, 9. And they just aren't. And so we learn from this where deficiencies are, and to make a long story short, there's a lot of issues of bypass and other things in some of the air handlers at U of T, a lot of issues with ventilation controls. And so it hasn't happened yet, but one could use these data to find and fix some of those defaults. So this is a kind of a cool approach, but definitely I have some concerns about it. One is that we see a little bit of evidence of bias. It might be underestimating a little bit. The other thing is that we can't tell the difference, let's say in a classroom, between a loss of CO2 or people breathing out CO2 leaving the room. Those will both show up the same in our model, and so there's some kind of messiness there. Sometimes you just don't see good decays. If a room is, kind of consistently occupied, or you just don't see a lot of good decays, so sometimes we had to monitor for a few weeks just to get enough decays. It's also kind of complicated. Like, I can explain how to do this, and we have a paper on it, but I certainly wouldn't want to kind of make this an actual standard just because of the underlying complexity to it. So that we want to do something simpler. So I have to come up with a better name for this, but I'm going to call it flip-flop testing for now. And so all we do is we take any strategy for air cleaning. I'm going to show you first some in-room results and then some central results, and we flip back and forth. So we run the air cleaner for a little while, and I'll talk about how much a little while is in a second. Then we run a placebo, which kind of makes it seem like it's air cleaning, but it's not. And then we flip back to the air cleaner, and we do that for a while. We're doing it for about 1 or 2 weeks most of the time. And then you can just compare the concentration with the air cleaner to the concentration with the placebo and see if the air cleaner is making a difference and how much of a difference it's making. And so this is what it actually looks like. So this is testing a room air cleaner. That gray thing on top of the air cleaner there is our placebo. It's a white noise generator. It's what's called a mechanical noise generator. It makes noise by moving air. And so we have a little remote-controlled outlet that switches back and forth between them when we need to do that. Some air cleaners, or we're doing this in my house now at the thermostat, make it a little bit hard to control remotely. So we have these remote-controlled switches where a little arm comes out and presses a button to turn on either the air cleaner or the placebo when we want to switch between them. So there's a lot of detail here, but fundamentally, the main thing we're interested in is the effectiveness. How much the air cleaner is reducing the concentration of particles in the environment. And so all we're doing is we're comparing the air cleaner to the placebo times, and when the effectiveness is 100%, that's a perfect air cleaner or filter, and when the number is 0, the air cleaner isn't doing anything. So we had to work out a lot of details here to do this. So one of them is how long should each of those periods be between the air cleaner and the placebo? We tried a lot of different times, and we ended up, right now, we do 2 hours and 30 minutes. If you make them too long, you end up not getting very many periods in a short amount of time. But if you make them too short, you end up having an influence of the previous period. And in fact, ends up biasing your answer. So we tried a bunch of different times, and this appears to be a good kind of medium between the two of them. And then we also wanted to make it something that didn't fit nicely into 24 hours, because a lot of what's going on is sources change. And so we wanted to not always be at 8 a.m. in placebo or air cleaner mode, because maybe the building is near a roadway and they get pollution coming in at that same time every day. So if you do it at 2.5 hours, on the next day it'll be offset, and next day it'll be offset even more. So you'll end up capturing any of those repetitive sources kind of distributed evenly. And then we want to truncate the data a little bit because of something I mentioned, that you get this bleed over from one period. So if you're running the placebo, the concentration will be artificially higher at the beginning of the air cleaner period because it takes a while for the air cleaner to catch up. So we ended up doing a bunch of things, and we truncate about ½ hour at the beginning of every period in all of our analysis. And here's an example of the results. These are data for 2 different air cleaners, a relatively low clean air delivery rate air cleaner on the left and a higher one on the right. And this is in both plots. Each plot is showing the same air cleaner deployed in 5 different environments, 2 classrooms, an office, and 2 different residences. And I want you to, let's just focus on the one on the left first, although you get it from both of them. The first thing I want to make the comment about is that these, in some cases, are really spread out. That's the reality. In the same building, even over relatively short periods of time, the same air cleaner will perform differently. That's because of things like there are sources at different times, there are people opening windows, there might be a central system that comes on at various times. And so this is the reality. It varies over time. But the other thing, and this is something that I think everyone knows already, but it's kind of comforting to have data that shows it clearly, that the very same air cleaner will perform differently in different environments. That's obvious. Some of these are bigger rooms, some of them are smaller rooms, some of them have pretty high ventilation rate, some of them have lower ventilation rate. And so, you can get an effectiveness on average of, let's say 40%, or you can get an effectiveness of 0%, and you need to plan for that because it's, of course, different in every environment. The higher performing air cleaner, or the higher CADR air cleaner on the right, does show much better performance in most of these environments. But again, there's still this big spread, both between environments and within the same environment. And this is so crucial to why I think we need to do this in situ testing, because we really need to see how well any given strategy is going to perform in any given environment. We did a lot of messing around to see how long you needed to test. I would like to say that we got it very short, right now, what we think we need to test for is somewhere on the order of about 10 periods, which translates to about 2 days of testing. You don't get all the variation if you test for 2 days, but you get a pretty good median that's pretty representative of testing for longer, and you capture some of the variation, not all of it for sure. And so I mentioned we hadn't achieved everything of the fast, cheap, flexible, and so on. Fast, I think a 2-day test it's not much in terms of testing. You just install the monitors, but still, it's a little bit longer than I think would be ideal. The other question we asked is, does the monitor matter? Does it matter what you're using to measure particles? My hope to this question would be it doesn't matter, so you can use whatever cheap, low-cost sensor you have. And so to test this, we tested an AirMaster, which is a very cheap particle monitor. We compared that to what's in blue here, a very expensive, very good particle monitor. That's kind of our truth. And then we used another low-cost optical monitor, the AlphaSense, as well. And you can see that for the particular results I'm showing here for one of our environments, the median is pretty consistent between the AirMaster and our truth, but the AlphaSense, our other low-cost monitor, is a little bit lower. And it turns out that's for a good reason. This particular low-cost monitor, like some other low-cost monitors, doesn't do as well at higher concentrations. So you can see that the blue and the green monitors kind of go up and are up at go up together, and the red is a little bit lower. So that's going to end up, that's why the red bar is, it's not terrible, but it is a little bit lower. So the monitor does matter, but there's lots of good low-cost particle monitors too. And of course, room mixing. And so we did, as part of these experiments, put particle monitors at different locations in the space. And you can see that this is showing the office and a couple of residential environments with some different air cleaners in place. And you can see that the 2 residential environments, those rooms are relatively small, relatively well mixed, not a lot of variation depending on where you measure. The office environment is not well mixed. So if you measure close to the air cleaner, you get a much higher effectiveness than if you measure 15 feet away, you get a much lower number. And we've all seen this, we all know this, but mixing can matter a lot. And so you have to pay attention to that in environments. So that's great. I feel good about what at least we can be transparent about and that it works for room-based systems. What about central systems? And so we've been trying this out. We've been doing it in my house as we just kind of figure this out. Eventually we'll go to some much bigger spaces and try it out. But you have to address some questions. In a big space, where do you care about? There's lots of different potential spaces to measure. With a central system, it's really not clear to me what a good placebo is. Are people responding to the noise that a central system makes? Are people responding to airflow? I don't know what the appropriate placebo is, although I know I have to have a placebo because people's behavior might change without one. And how do you deal with the fact that most central systems, or many central systems, are quite dynamic? They might be variable air volume, they might have different operation modes based on scheduling or outdoor air conditions or other things. And so you can get this huge kind of background variation, and it can be hard to untangle the filter from that. So here's an example of the results. These are from my house. We don't use it, we use filters, but there is installed in the house from the previous owners an electronic air cleaner. I won't mention the manufacturer. So we did a test. This is a week of data. We measured the particle concentration in lots of different places in the house, 5 different locations that you can see here. And you can see the effectiveness here. And there is a little bit of a tail, but the median effectiveness is 0, meaning operating this air cleaner did not make a difference to our PM2.5 concentrations on average. And one thing I should have said in leading up to this, our placebo here is this particular air cleaner has like a metal screen filter, like a pre-filter. So that's our base case here. So we never were running with no filter. We were running with that pre-screen filter. But that pre-screen is doing most of the heavy lifting for this particular air cleaner. And I should mention that, before I leave that we're redoing these experiments. Actually, we did that last week just to confirm our results, and then now we've moved on this week to testing actual filters. Hopefully we'll see a difference. One of the things I'm interested in, there's lots of air cleaners that might generate byproducts, so it would be nice to see byproducts. And the short answer is we're not seeing byproducts, and I'll talk a little bit about why I think that is in a second. But the first plot here shows just the low-cost sensors we use often have a VOC sensor on them. This is comparing the VOC concentrations between the air cleaner and the placebo periods. You don't see any difference. So this is with an air cleaner that should generate some byproducts. We're not seeing it in our data. The figure on the right is ozone concentrations that we measured in my house with this electronic air cleaner. And same sort of story. If you look at that scale, it's really tiny. We're not seeing ozone being produced by this air cleaner at all. I think the real question here is, I'm pretty sure that there are some byproducts being produced in both those cases, but we're not seeing them. And I think we're not seeing them because the cheap volatile organic carbon compound sensors don't do well for seeing a lot of the VOCs that might be produced by these air cleaners. So we're trying a few different things. We got a whole bunch of different low-cost VOC sensors that are kind of intended for different purposes. We're hoping kind of a network of them might show byproducts if they exist. We've also started using some kind of cheap ion sensors to at least be able to generate if there's differences in ion concentration in the air as well. So we're trying different things around byproducts, but that's where we are now. So we're doing this, we're doing a lot more central system testing, and where we're moving to once we finish the kind of preliminary stuff in my house is we're doing some blinded testing. We're doing some testing in a building where we don't know what type of filter is installed. And so we're just going to look at the data and see what the results are, and then it will be revealed to us what filter was present. So that's one of the ways we're trying to avoid bias. We're also doing some work looking at removing of specific pollutants. So we've been focused on viruses. So we've been looking at SARS-CoV-2 RNA, RSV, another virus, influenza, the virus that causes the flu. And so we've been looking at those specific ones to answer the question, how well does a filter actually remove those specific viruses, or at least the RNA that causes those viruses in different indoor environments. We're also, and I didn't put this on the slide, but should have said it, is that we're also trying to look at occupancy testing. So I would argue that you maybe only care about how well a filter is working when people are there to breathe the air. And so we're looking at, can we just look at periods of time when the space is occupied, which we measure with occupancy sensors, and come up with an effectiveness that actually matters to people in the space. So those are some of the things we're doing. So I think that the overall goal here is that real-world testing could really establish the benefit of filtration for specific spaces. And when we first came up with this in the context of the university, the idea was you could use quick in situ testing to establish, hey, I've got a problem. There's air bypassing my filter. My filter needs to be changed. My ventilation controls need attention. And so you could use this to identify those things in a way that is, I don't know if it's easier, but it's at least a little bit more independent of how some of those things are usually tracked down, if at all. And of course, we're aiming for something that's cheaper than other approaches, which tend to be quite expensive for this. And a question, before I move on to some other things, a question here that I would kind of leave with the audience that hope to have some conversation with people about is, are customers going to understand that the same filter performs differently in different environments and potentially differently over time in the same environment? And there's already, potential for customer confusion around a lot of filtration issues. And so is this just going to add to the mix? I mean, it happens, but that isn't always helpful. So that's something we've been thinking a lot about. So I always like to spend the last few minutes talking about ongoing filtration research in my lab. So when I last spoke to NAFA in Montreal in 2019, I talked about work we're doing on cognitive function testing, where we expose people to air pollution, usually indoor air pollution of different sources, and then we measure their cognitive function with a cognitive battery. And this is with Mike Mack, a colleague in psychology. And so we did an interesting experiment that's published at the reference down in the bottom, where we took essential oil diffusers. Some of you probably know what they are. Turns out they're enormous particle generators. And we exposed people to a placebo, which was very pure distilled water in an essential oil diffuser. And then we did a same variant, but had a lemon-scented essential oil, and then grapeseed. Grapeseed is unscented to my nose, although the participants could detect it. It was intended to be unscented. And the short answer of that research is that essential oil diffuser emissions affect people's cognitive function. And the one piece of cognitive function that rises way above the level of significance is impulsive decision-making. So you know when you go into a store and they're clearly putting a scent into the air? That's done very deliberately, and it's done to make people more impulsive and to spend more money. We did some research last year, which we're still working on analyzing the data, but we tried that same sort of experiment, but in this case, we filtered the particles. So we exposed people to essential oil diffusers emissions, and in one case we had a placebo running. In the other case, we had an actual decent filter that removed most of the particles from the source. And we found that filtering the particles improved cognitive function in several domains. So that's an interesting kind of benefit. We also, over the past few years, received funding to buy an MRI-compatible dosing system. So now what we're moving to, and there's a ton of ethics and other approvals that we're working through right now, is we can image people's brains while we expose them to things. And my colleague in psychology, Mike, believes that we'll be able to understand mechanistically what's happening to people's brains when they're exposed to air pollution. And the last point I'll mention about the cognitive function research is some recent stuff that's come out in the literature, as well as kind of a broad literature review, suggests that VOCs might be really, really important to cognitive function as well. So we're gearing up to do some specific experiments with both formaldehyde and toluene to explore specifically what's going on with VOCs, independent of any effects of particles. Another area that my group has spent a lot of time in is, can we use filters better? So this is some work that Amy Lee did. She's now a professor at the University of Waterloo, where she considered 4 control strategies for running any type of filter. One of them is a very common method. You have a particle sensor, and just when the concentration goes above a threshold, you turn on your filter, or you turn it on a higher speed, and when it goes below the threshold, you turn it off. She combined that with something called a source concentration. That's where you detect when a source is present, and you use your concentration threshold and operate the air cleaner based on that. If you look in the literature, there are some older articles on something called pulsed air cleaning. That's where you turn on a fan for relatively high speed for short bursts. And if you want to murder your fans, this is kind of an interesting strategy. But the idea here is you tend to get better performance than that. And then she combined that with the concentration method. So you go above a threshold, you pulse the air cleaner until you're below the threshold. And it's really nice work. It's kind of complicated, but I just want to show you an example of the results. So what you see here are those 4 different strategies, are the 4 colors there. The boxes here are different types of buildings that she looked at in this work. And what's on the outside of that brown quarter circle is a high concentration ambient environment. We use New Delhi. And what's on the inside is a lower concentration environment. We use data from Toronto. And what you see here is a spread. You can always kind of balance how much you're reducing concentration and how often you're running your air cleaner. But you can start to make very specific decisions based on your context of how much you want to reduce concentration versus how much you want to run the fan, moving air through your filter. And so you can start having a decision approach that says, look, we're at a time when, maybe the building isn't terribly occupied and we don't value concentration reduction very much, so we're going to save some fan energy. And you can start doing those types of trade-offs. Alex Mendel, a current student, followed up on that, and he did some work developing what he called an adaptive threshold. So we had data from 75 apartments in Toronto, and every apartment is different. Some of them had smokers, some of them opened their windows a lot. Every apartment is different. So he used a different approach and said, hey, when is the concentration elevated? Again, used a simple machine learning model to do that, and run the air cleaner when the concentration is elevated. And just focus on the bottom row here. Using this approach, you could get about 60% of the benefit of using a filter running the fan only 7% of the time on average compared to running it continuously. And so, some people care more about energy than other people, but I'm always a little confused when people focus a lot on the pressure drop of filters when we could achieve much, much larger benefits by just deciding when we're going to run the system or when we're going to run it on a high speed. So I think this shows a lot of promise, and he's continued this work, and we're gearing up to do some testing in real buildings with air cleaners that actually use some of these alternative control strategies. The last thing I want to talk about isn't really research, but I think it's important to talk about, and that is we saw a lot of discussion of indoor air quality during COVID. And I was approached by a couple of individuals who work for one of the hospitals in Toronto, and they were pointing out that community-based organizations, community health clinics, homeless shelters, drop-in centers, they were not having good information about what to do to improve their indoor air quality or during COVID to reduce the risk of transmission. So the first thing we did is we started office hours. Every Tuesday, myself, a couple of advocates, particularly homeless shelters, someone from public health, Amy, former student and colleague, would just meet with any organization who wanted to meet. We'd talk about their building, talk about their concerns, talk about what they could do. Some of these were owned buildings where they had a lot of control over things like filtration. Others were rented where they had very little control. We just talked through their various options. And one of the things that came up a lot over that is that these organizations didn't have much money to do improvements. So we got a little bit of grant money, and we hired a grant writer to work with these organizations so they could write grants to mostly the provincial government to get resources to upgrade their HVAC systems or to invest in other things to improve their indoor air quality. And I mention this because there is a huge need for good, unbiased information in a lot of communities that don't have access to it. We created a checklist, which now is in its 4th version, which is plain language guidance that's geared for these community organizations. The things they can do, things they should look at to address indoor air quality in general. And so this has been useful in a lot of these organizations when they're making decisions about resource allocation, looking at what they should do, how they should allocate resources. And everyone knows about the Canadian wildfires because they impacted a lot of the US. But last summer, we had really extreme wildfires. This becomes really important in a lot of these communities, particularly those that are unhoused or underhoused, spending a lot of time outside. So we wrote some specific guidance for wildfire smoke that, unfortunately, I think is going to be relevant for this year as well. And all these are freely available, and we still continue the office hours a little bit less frequently than we were before, basically as needed. But I think that this type of effort would really benefit from people from the filtration industry getting involved, because there are a lot of fundamental filter questions that really benefit from having a bunch of different voices at the table. So I'll finish off here by saying, it's a great time for filtration research, but we really need to provide direct evidence that filters are working. And whether a filter is working or not is such dependent on the building, the system, and so on. And we focus a lot on the filter, but really we should be focusing on that context. And the real-world test approaches that I mentioned, kind of offer a pathway to how we can document how well filters are working. And hopefully there'll be others generated by other people as well. So thanks very much. Be glad to take questions.
Jeff, I'm curious about the testing that you did in the room. You were looking at specific, like COVID and flu. How did you actually do that? What sort of testing equipment?
Yeah, so we use an approach that I call quantitative filter forensics. So we deploy little portable air cleaners. We use a filter media, a flat sheet filter media that's a little bit easier for us to extract from. And so we deploy those. We were doing typically about a week of deployment. And then we go back to the lab and we extract off the filter, which is a physical and a chemical process. A little bit laborious and so on, but Zoe, the student, got quite good at it. And then we use qPCR, originally qPCR, now dPCR, digital PCR, to take that dust that we take off the filter and look for the RNA. And, one of the things COVID did is lots of people were looking at wastewater as a surveillance technique. And in fact, one of the labs on campus does all the wastewater testing for Ontario. And so they already had kind of a lot of that biological pipeline set up. And the last comment I would make about it is that we realized at the end of the project, a big hassle is vacuuming off the filter. So we switched to swabbing with a Q-tip. It's not a Q-tip. I call it a Q-tip. It's a sterile biological swab. But anyway, we sample with that, and we get pretty good numbers when you do that. It's not quite as good as going through all the hassle of vacuum extraction. But so that's how we do it. And flu and RSV especially, are very challenging. Flu is a little bit nicer, but we're still playing around with that. So we've been deploying all fall and winter. We've had filters deployed in classrooms that we're trying different extraction techniques for those organisms.
In your research, I assume you're testing a lot of different types of air cleaners.
Indeed, yeah.
And one of the popular air cleaners out there now are these ionic generators, both in commercial and residential applications. How effective are they, or do they do anything at all?
Right. So let me just be clear that some of you know my history in this area. I'm not mentioning any companies. So the first response to that is the word ionizing describes this whole range of technologies. So there are some devices that put ions into a space, other devices that charge particles to enhance the removal to a filter. There's hugely different amounts of ions. There's even different types of ions. So there's no kind of one answer to that question. But I would say that I look at it as you should be a good consumer if you're thinking about ion generating technologies, because some of them can cause harms. So there's papers that ions by themselves can cause harm. Some of these devices generate ozone. Some of them generate other byproducts. So you want to make sure that you're not causing harm, first of all. And then the second thing is there is a lot more marketing claim than there is actually demonstrated benefit. So I'll make no secret of the fact that one of the reasons we thought about the kind of flip-flop testing, is there's nothing I'd like to do more than take different types of air cleaners, including ion-generating air cleaners, put them in a space, and you get the answer. Flip them on and off over time. Either they make a difference or they don't. And that's the answer that you're looking for. And the short answer is we've tried only 2 different types of ionizing air cleaners, one of which you saw, the one in my house, and we saw no effect. Now, I'm not saying that's true of all ionizing air cleaners, but that's what we found.
Let's give it up for Jeff.
Good.
Thanks for listening to the Talking Air Filtration podcast, a production of the National Air Filtration Association. Clean air matters.